The First World War was a transformative event, and no less so in the realms of economics or society. And in helping try and plunge the depths of the effects of this war, I've broken down what we're going to cover in this review session into three sections. The economic section, namely looking at the importance of industry and the economy to this war, how we get to a point where we refer to the First World War as a total war, demanding the totality of the home front's effort on the nation's behalf. Secondly, looking at propaganda. How did the nation compel or cause people to stay the course? How did they convince them to keep fighting, to keep going, to keep sacrificing for the state? And lastly, probably one of the gravest outcomes of the war, not simply the loss of life, but the loss of Western confidence in itself, the loss of any sense that Western civilization was right, proper, or correct. A great deal of people emerged from the war believing that the war proved perhaps the falsehood of many of the ideals that the West had promoted prior to the conflict. So, to begin, the most important thing to understand about the Great War is that it was an industrial war. To give you just one example, when the Germans attacked the French at the Battle of Verdun, they opened their attack with a barrage lasting 10 hours in which they launch 1 million shells at the French lines. You cannot have such prodigious armament if you aren't rallying the entire nation to your side and churning out every last ounce of the productive capacity of your economy. The very nature of a global war in which millions are fighting and you're being forced to equip so many meant that you were going to be in what was termed a total war, where the totality of the economy was used to help support the war effort. Now, the nature of this industrial war goes along several paths. First, it demanded that governments have a much more expansive role in the economy. They needed to be involved in setting hours, setting prices, trying to regulate and prevent workers from striking in order to ensure, more than anything, a consistent output of war material to continue the fight. Governments all across Europe become much more involved in managing the economy to try and ensure that they get the output that they need to continue the war. Second, the very importance of industry to the war effort meant that the home front, if you will, became a front in the war as well. The war, if you will, created a dangerous question. Are factory workers, people working in an industry to produce armaments or arms, are they a legitimate target? And this is a deep question, one that we still haven't answered, precisely because in this intersection of industry and warfare, it's hard to parse the line. If you go off and work in a factory and produce shells, such as the shells that the Germans will launch on Verdun, would the French be justified in trying to destroy your factory, perhaps with you in it? It's a dangerous question, and one that we haven't really come to a satisfactory answer. But that question of the anonymous German factory worker and French decision-making underscores the difficult moral questions we've been left because industry has become so critical to warfighting. But other examples of the home front becoming a war front matter. The British blockade, for example, of the German home front was a debilitating attack on the German economy and the German civilians, because the British engaged in a blockade that tried to stop any last amount of war material, up to and including food, from reaching the German population. This meant that the German population, as the war went on, suffered more and more grievously as the war continued in terms of food shortages, other shortages of daily life. Indeed, in the aftermath of the war, many families were haunted by memories of malnutrition, famine, and the like due to the British blockade of the German home front. In response, certainly, the Germans were more than willing to attack the home front of Great Britain in order to try and deter their war effort. Specifically, they used Zeppelins, huge Zeppelin aircraft, well, not aircraft, but heavier than air ships, These were if you think of the Hindenburg, that's an example of a Zeppelin, the famed Hindenburg that blew up in New York, New Jersey. And so the Zeppelins were launched against London in order to drop bombs on British factories and deter economic output. The problem is this carried a cost, namely, as the Zeppelins were not capable of great accuracy, they would just drop bombs out and hope they hit the factories. This, of course, ensured civilian casualties and thus, again, raised questions of if you can hit the civilians in terms of preventing industrial output, why wouldn't you? So again, this home front, this second strand, this home front becomes a literal front in the war as well. Third, the power of the Second Industrial Revolution was fully unleashed in the form of new weaponry. Submarines, tanks, machine guns that we've seen before were used in prodigious numbers, new and heavier artillery pieces. Even the chemical industry was drawn into the conflict as both sides utilized gas technology, chemical weapons against their enemies in an attempt to win the war at the front. Now, this commitment to total war did bring about a social change. We tend to think of women working in factories in the Second World War, Rosie the Riveter and all the rest of this. But World War I featured heavy numbers of women involved in industries in nearly all countries. And this carries a great social change. If you remember that Victorian attitude of the separate spheres, one for men and one for women, this had led to a great deal of resistance towards women getting the right to vote. And indeed, when suffragettes were trying to achieve the right to vote in the years preceding the war, they were met with great resistance. But after the war, after seeing so many women work in the factory for the front, for the people, for the cause, if you will, the resistance to women gaining the franchise, the resistance to the suffragette movement collapsed. Across Western Europe, America, countries opened up the right to vote to women, largely, many people argue, in response to recognizing their sacrifices during the war. Another example of the totality of the war was through propaganda. The demands of the war were so great that governments had to be actively involved in trying to promote citizen involvement and promote the people to greater sacrifices to win the war. A good example of these were drives for war bonds or liberty bonds, asking people to not simply commit themselves to sending off sons or brothers or fathers or husbands to the front, not simply maybe working in war factories, but even contributing monetarily to the war effort to support the cause and keep the troops fighting. Another example of propaganda was posters that were less geared towards calling you to greater sacrifice and more trying to paint the war in a stark moral black and white dimension, thus presenting you with a motivation to fight because the enemy is evil incarnate and your side is on the side of the angels. Examples of this include British propaganda that depicted the Germans as being recreations of the barbaric Huns, while in contrast, German propaganda, up to and including Christmas cards with this phrase on it, begged that God would strike down England for joining the war against Germany. But in the case of Great Britain, you can see even one other element of propaganda to try and urge sacrifice and effort in the form of a famed recruiting poster. Because Britain, unlike most of the other combatants at the outbreak of the war, did not have conscription. It did not have a draft. And thus they had to rely on volunteers. And one of the famed posters of this period is one in which a little girl is sitting on her father's lap, and the banner of the poster simply says, "Daddy, what did you do during the war?" In many ways, what you can see is an attempt to guilt men into volunteering, guilt them into sacrificing, to joining up for the fight, for the cause. Propaganda had enabled people to keep fighting, but the war did become more and more devastating. As industry was unleashed, as more and more people were called to the fight, the war grew more costly and costlier still. Millions were being chewed up in the front with seemingly no end in sight. But even after the war, the West wouldn't ever truly recover. And this carries to our last social dimension of this conflict. Namely, one of the biggest social ramifications was a massive loss in confidence by the West in itself. Little was not shaken, if not shattered, during the war. Consider some of the things that Western civilization might have put its trust in. Technology. Well, didn't technology prove that man was just simply more inhuman, more willing to come up with new ways of killing his fellow man? Would you put your trust in liberalism? Well, liberal government hadn't stopped the war, and indeed many democracies had gone off to war. Parliaments had voted for war. Do you put your faith in European civilization? Well, what exactly about European civilization seems that civilized during the Great War? And do you believe you are in an age of progress? What progress is the Great War? What are you progressing towards? And so this great loss of confidence is probably best exemplified by a war poem by Wilfred Owen called Dulce et Decorum Est. And in terms of an intersection, this poem features a gas attack, the gas attack in the aftermath of a chemical weapons attack on his unit. But the poem is more meaningful still because in describing the horrors of a gas attack, the suffering inflicted on the soldiers from that, he attacks something deeper. He attacks the confidence. He attacks the drive of Western civilization that's had so gladly gone off to war in 1914. Indeed, his poem and what it takes its title is that he critiques the reader, that they should not allow the old lie to continue, the old lie that it was a sweet and noble thing to die for one's country. And so in that, what you should see is a turn, a loss in confidence. Consider the nation. Isn't that your Volk? Isn't that your people's spirit? Go back to how nationalism has inflamed the passions and led to revolutions across most of the modules we've read up till now. And here you have someone at the end of this deep, abiding, powerful national conflict saying, it's all a lie, it's all a lie. Don't let your children believe it. And so what this indicates is one of the gravest social ramifications of the war is a loss of confidence in the West in itself.